Hello and welcome to this lecture on Edith Pretty and the Sutton Hoo treasure. It is dedicated to one of her nieces, Mary Hopkirk, who was the family historian, and also to Edith herself, who was a big part of my family as well. She was a cousin of my grandmother's, who was one of her bridesmaids, as was my great aunt Barbara. So, Edith Pretty. Here she is, born Edith May Dempster in 1883 in Elland in Yorkshire. There are a number of differences between the real Mrs. Pretty and the Mrs. Pretty who will be depicted in the Netflix film coming out tomorrow, the 29th of January, called The Dig. She was not born in Sheffield. She was actually born in a little place called Elland in Yorkshire. And her mother did not die when she was a child. Her mother, in fact, died when Edith was already in her 30s. And the cousin, called Lomax, he does not exist as an actual person, but there are a number of cousins who did come to visit, including my grandmother, the brothers and sisters, the Hovey cousins, and particularly her nephew, Russell, who divined that there was gold and silver underneath the mound, which was eventually excavated and was found to contain the extraordinary treasure. So here is Edith. These are her parents, Elizabeth and Robert Dempster. Edith grew up in the rarefied and safe world of the industrial elite. Her father and his brother, John Dempster, my great-great-grandfather, with their formidable and often bejewelled wives, were the grand Edwardians by any standards, really. These millionaire brothers, though, were grandsons of another Robert Dempster, who scandalously died on board a prison hulk bound for Bermuda. The reason being that he got into a drunken brawl with another slater, and the slater hit him, he hit the slater back, and the slater tragically died from this hit a few hours later. And Robert handed himself in, but it was not really a glossy history. And Mary Hopkirk and the rest of the family simply said that Robert had fallen off a bridge drunkenly. They did not say he died aboard a prison hulk heading for Bermuda. Anyhow, these two Dempster brothers, Robert Dempster here on the right, and John Dempster, my great-great-grandfather, lived in palatial houses. Here is Vale Royal, where Edith spent much of her youth. And this is Keel Hall, where my great-grandmother spent much of her youth. So these two brothers lived in these very grand houses. They were the tycoons of their day and lived a gilded Edwardian life. Edith was descended from one of the numerous branches of the Dempster family of Kerriston Castle, which stands very close to the town of Broughton in Scotland. The family name of Dempster is derived from the judicial official name for Dempster, an office which corresponds to that of judge, really. In 1379, King Robert II conferred on Andrew Dempster of Kerriston the office of hereditary Dempster, or Dempster, to the States of Parliament. Clan Dempster was a lowland clan, and the family historically held the rank of laird or baron, so they were sort of minor landowning aristocracy in Scotland. Robert Dempster, though, the founder of the family gas engineering empire, was the sixth Robert Dempster in succession, and part of the family fortune was actually entailed on him. He was summoned to Broughton to claim it. In the event, a female Dempster relation acquired in his stead. Either way, Robert, a canny Scot, started his own dynasty. Here is the crest used by Edith's grandfather, and it is the crest of the Dempsters of Broughton, with the motto of the Dempsters of Skibo Castle. And here is Robert Dempster, Edith's grandfather. The Dempsters have been based in and close to the town of Broughton since at least the 1670s. One of the family was secretary to Mary of Modena, while another, Thomas Dempster, was a famous scholar and historian who was thrown into prison for being a spy by Pope Paul V. George Dempster of Skibo Castle, a kinsman, was a director of the East India Company. Monumental clan feuds and warlike disregard for authority led to the fall of Clan Dempster. They were also Episcopalians and as such were relegated to the fringes of Scottish society. This accounts for the lack of birth and death certificates and other useful genealogical gleanings. The direct forebears of Robert, this Robert here, Edith's grandfather, born in 1828, were relatively lowly people. The success of the family business created opportunities for the family that would have been unthinkable a generation or two before. It also led to great family feuds, which saw a father and two brothers fall out dramatically. My great-great-grandfather, John Dempster of Keel Hall, died without ever reconciling with his father, Robert, or his brother, Robert, Edith's father, which was a great shame, and really only after his death did the families get back together again. Here is the little cottage in Ashlar Lane where Robert Dempster was born. On the 17th of October in 1828, his mother, Sarah Lawrence, was the daughter of a soldier in the Rutland Regiment of Fencible Light Dragoons who had come to Scotland to defend the Fife Coast against the French. Robert Dempster, her husband, was a slater. In October 1830, at the age of 23, he was involved in this drunken brawl with another slater. The other man struck Robert, who then struck him back. The blow to the head later killed the other man. Robert handed himself in and died aboard the prison hulk, Boadicea, which was bound for Bermuda in 1839. The story of this was not thought suitable for the descendants of this Robert, so of course it was very much not spoken about. It wasn't thought suitable for the grandfather of two millionaire brothers. Anyway, Robert Jr. was given a good education at the grammar school in Cooper. In 1842, he left Cooper for Edinburgh to inquire about a post at the Cochrane & Co. brass founders and gas meters on Greenside Lane. The manager was a Mr. Mackay, who had gone home by the time Robert had reached the works. He was told to come back in the morning. So the young penniless Scot waited all night by the light of a gas lamp. In the morning, he saw a well-dressed gentleman in a top hat coming briskly across the street. "Excuse me, sir, are you Mr. Mackay?" Robert said. "Go away, boy, go away," retorted Mr. Mackay, supposing him to be a beggar. But determined not to forfeit the one chance, Robert persisted and so impressed the old man with his enthusiasm that he was taken on. Having learned all about the meter manufacture, he became meter inspector at the Dundee Gasworks. And on October the 13th, 1850, he married Elizabeth Bonella, who came from an old Scottish family that could trace its ancestry back over 5 centuries to some Italian brothers who came over to Scotland, apparently were washed ashore in the 16th century, and that's where the name Bonella comes from. Her home was Springfield near Cooper, where the family owned a pleasant house and farmed 100 acres. The house itself is a handsome stone-built house with symmetrical farm buildings. It's still there. Robert's marriage to Elizabeth was socially advantageous as well as long and happy. Here is the logo which Robert Dempster decided to use for his first business. R. Dempster and Sons, gas engineers, Dare Lucem, give light. And there is the little lamppost with the factory in the background by which Robert waited all night to acquire his first job. And here are Robert and Elizabeth on the left, and with some of their family on the right at their house in Wales, Eden Hall, in Penmaenmawr. I'm probably pronouncing that completely wrong, in North Wales. On the top right, you've got Edith, and then in this photograph on the right, and then on the left, you've got her cousin Nellie, and in the middle, you've got dear old Robert Dempster. They're quite an old widower, next door to one of his granddaughters, Anne Carver, and also Elizabeth Dempster, Edith's sister, later Perkins, and in front, Sir Walter Robert Dempster Perkins, as he became, and his sister Mary Hopkirk, who wrote so much of the family history. So Robert Sr. became one of the first members of the British Association of Gas Managers, and I was at their first meeting in Manchester in 1864. He took a post in London in about 1853. Here he was employed as a foreman to the meter repairing shop at the Phoenix Gasworks in Vauxhall High Street. London was very bad for his health. He moved the family back to Yorkshire in 1855, where he obtained the post of manager of the gasworks. Robert acquired a business partner, Mr. Beaumont, and the two started an exploratory consultancy agency with offices in Elland and Halifax. Within a few years, Mr. Beaumont had ceased to be involved, and Robert founded his own gasworks, called Rosemount Works on the Huddersfield Road. This later became Robert Dempster and Sons of Elland. And here is his neat little factory. On the left is his villa called Rosemount, behind the stable block, and then the factory to the right. It's rather lovely to see this, very much the small beginnings of a great company, but the neatness and the pride he must have had in this early works, with its little cupola on the right, its little bell tower, which would summon people to work, and the carriages and horses going past. So, as I said, he was very indebted to Mr. Mackay and this opportunity, which came about by sitting under the lamppost all night. Robert wrote a song called The Good Old Gaslight Company for the Manchester District Association of Gas Engineers. One of the verses goes as follows, and he wasn't particularly a great poet. Once a year, this jolly crew meet round their jovial board. Roast beef and beer and other cheer their governors do afford. They drink to all, both great and small, and peace to all around, declare their bark, in light or dark, to be both safe and sound. 'Twas a jolly old gaslight company, all of the olden time. So the Dempster coach would rumble through Ellen's cobbled streets on way to chapel every Sunday. Robert's two eldest sons, Robert, Edith's father, and John, my great-great-grandfather, were educated boarding school at Kippax Hall, a school for young gentlemen near Leeds, which sounds Dickensian in its uncomfortable type character. The two younger Dempster boys, Alexander and Albert, attended university in Germany. The latter was very much the black sheep of the family and was sent to live in Australia. Alexander ran the family gasworks in Sedbergh for his two older brothers, and the Dempster daughters were educated at Waterclough Hall Ladies' Academy at Southerham in Yorkshire, which was a well-known boarding school run by the Mrs. Gregory. So this is the generation before Edith. In 1878, Robert Sr., who adored travelling, went with his wife to Palestine, accompanied, as was necessary, by a small army for which he had to pay. He also took his sons and their spouses on a boat cruise down the Rhine, and he later published a book about this trip and lectured on the subject. Apparently these lectures were very long and not particularly interesting, probably rather like this. Anyway, the second factory, the business flourished, but his two eldest sons had even grander ideas. And in 1883, they broke away and moved to Manchester to set up R&J Dempster Limited at Newton Heath. Robert Dempster was put into what really was a forced retirement. He moved to Penmaenmawr in North Wales, I hope I'm saying that correctly, do please correct me, where he built a villa called Eden Hall, named after the river that ran through his native Cooper in Fife. And what was notable really about this house, not this rather ugly marine residence as his great-granddaughter Mary Hopkirk calls it, but it was actually the magnificent garden, which was made in about 1882. He created an observatory at the top of the house to indulge in his passion for astrology. He also owned and built a gasworks there. He died at Eden Hall on the 19th of January, 1913. He was 85, a Freemason and senior deacon of the Congregational Church, on which he bestowed an organ. Before this, on the 13th of December 1900, the Dempster children had presented their parents with a solid 18-carat gold cup for their golden wedding party, which took place at Norwood in Broughton Park, home of Edith's parents. All the Dempster ladies were given a heart-shaped golden locket containing portraits of Robert and Elizabeth. It was really the last time that the family got together under joyful circumstances. So here in this picture, you see the works in Elland. Bottom left, you've got Robert's house, Rosemount, with the tennis court to the left of it. So he was retired and built this house in Penmaenmawr, which is Eden Hall, with its magnificent garden, which his grandchildren remembered. The fountain was pretty noisy at the front, and there was a coach house, this huge greenhouse, and quite a lot of fun to be had for the children. So the two young Dempsters, Edith's father and my great-great-grandfather, moved to Broughton Park in Manchester, a development of large villas built for the newly rich on the edge of Manchester in Old Parkland belonging to Broughton Hall. In around 1900, John, my great-great-grandfather, leased Grimsney House and the estate and created a golf course there and moored his two yachts, Thekla, 49 tons, and Volavon, 104 tons, below the park on the loch. This was at Loch Galhead in Scotland. And in 1907, Robert Dempster, Edith's father, took on the 25-year lease of Vale Royal Abbey in Cheshire. This huge and ancient house was owned by the Delamere family, and it was here that Edith's parents really joined the ranks of the rich country elite. The house had an indoor staff of 25, with 18 gardeners and other people working in the stables. One man came once every week to wind up the dozens of clocks, while two footmen had the lengthy job of polishing the half-a-ton chandelier in the state dining room. A huge family feud resulted in John Dempster of Keele, my great-great-grandfather, never seeing his father again, and accordingly that branch of the family was left out of his will. The impasse does not show John in a good light. His brother had been asked by his sister, Agnes Hovey, if her sons, both of whom had very good war records and had won the Military Cross, could be taken into the business. Robert immediately said, yes, of course they can. But John was furious that he had not been consulted and refused it. He never spoke to his father again, and he died not long after at Keele Hall, while he was dressing for dinner. I've recently found out that to make some amends, John had actually paid for the public school education for both of his nephews. So that was at least something. So this was the house where Edith was born. This is the next door house to their grandfather's at Elland. So Grove House it was called. So Robert and Elizabeth had two daughters, and they'd been married in 1879, and two daughters, Elizabeth and Edith. Both girls were born at Grove House here, their home close to the Rosemount Works in Elland. From there, they moved into the manager's house, their grandfather's house, once he'd moved to Wales, which Robert Dempster Sr. had vacated. Robert's daughter Elizabeth remembered the house in Elland as, I quote, had a very large window and the white marble mantelpiece in the drawing room, and another remembrances of two ball dresses. One was in white and gold with spots on it, and the other was a blue trimmed with silver. And to me, they were like fairyland dresses. Elizabeth Dempster Sr. remembered how uncomfortable Rosemount was, with its outside WC at the bottom of the garden. At this time, the two Dempster sons were working with their father. But as I said, in 1883, a monumental row had led Robert Jr. and John breaking away from their father to found their rival business, which then eventually amalgamated at Newton Heath in Manchester. So there is Robert, and there is Elizabeth. So these are Edith's parents. And you can see really they were quite grand Edwardian ladies and gentlemen by that time. And this is the works which was founded by Edith's father and my ancestor John. Water and steam had powered the Industrial Revolution, yet it was gas that brought light to the rapidly growing population. The Dempsters had been involved in the gas industry since its birth. Every town in Britain acquired a gas company, which piped gas along every street and to each house. The Rosemount gasworks in Elland supplied gas to the smaller towns. Robert and John Dempster, by virtue of them setting up in a major city such as Manchester, supplied much larger equipment, in particular the vast gas holders, those huge round things that you still see in the ground. The business expands across the world, and the Dempsters monopolized the market for gas equipment. This is inside the works. You can see pretty basic how it looks, but full of people working hard, and they were very well thought of as employers. This is just one of the pieces of gas equipment. This is at Brisbane in Australia. Robert and John Dempster's lifestyles reflected their huge new wealth. In 1886, their firm manufactured and shipped 6 full gasworks to colonial towns not previously lit with gas, besides executing large contracts for Brisbane, Parramatta, Sydney, Melbourne, Tasmania, New Zealand, the Queensland government. The firm's operations extended to Brussels, Amsterdam, Aix-la-Chapelle, Berlin, Nîmes, Haarlem, Stolberg, Vienna, Modena, Messina, Ehrenfeld, Veracruz, Pernambuco, Buenos Aires, La Plata, and more. In 1887, the capital in the business was £100,000 and later £1 million. The directors were Robert Dempster, Esquire, of Rosemount, Elland, and Eden Hall, Penman Mar, Alexander Dempster of Rosemount, Herbert Well Blundell of Clifton Chambers and Ince Blundell, John Collier of Hazelwood, Halifax, and more. By the time of Robert Dempster Sr. in 1890, the business in Elland covered over 12 acres, and by 1955 it covered 26 acres. And this is another one of the smaller works complete works erected by the Dempsters, and that is Elland, covering 26 acres by the time this photograph was taken. And here is an example of their works, the largest spiral guided gas holder in the world, erected at Belfast by Robert and John Dempster. So by this time, the business was turning over millions of pounds, and these two men were extremely fortunate in their ways of life. So Robert and Elizabeth, with their young family, moved to Broughton Park, this newly rich suburb in Manchester. Manchester's grandees lived a life more akin to the American millionaires than the aspiring gentry. Here are Edith and Elizabeth Dempster. Picture them at the time they would have moved to Broughton Park. And this is their rather ugly, spooky looking house where they were brought up in their childhood. Norwood, a large villa that commanded magnificent views across the fields that surrounded it. Mary Hopkirk, a granddaughter of Robert and Elizabeth and niece of Edith Pretty, wrote that, I quote, Norwood was a commodious grey brick 3-storied villa, like an Edwardian doll's house, with stables, a largish garden and a meadow all surrounded with a stone wall. On the east side of the house lay the park of Broughton Hall. Mary wrote that indoors, Norwood was a perfect late Victorian period piece. Everything was tasteless, very expensive and rather vulgar. I remember the impressive brass bedsteads with red and blue plush hangings, ornamented with woolen pom-poms, window curtains of satin and velvet, draped and swathed and fringed, suspended from fat brass poles on noisy, rattling rings, acres of Nottingham lace obscuring enormous plate glass windows, canopies, padded, embossed velvet, cosy corners in mirror-lined alcoves in Swadhistan Turkish style, large red mahogany furniture, shiny yellow oak bedroom suites, brass gasoliers with ornamental chains suspended from them, immensely thick, ugly patterned red and blue Turkey carpets, highly varnished paintings of cattle and sheep in heavy gilt frames, innumerable small tables covered with miniature silver ornaments, lurid green and yellow Art Nouveau china pots on bamboo stands containing ferns and aspidistras, a huge sideboard of heavily carved Austrian oak loaded with silver and colored bohemian glass, and everywhere Japanese screens and fans, Turkish chairs and tables inlaid with mother of pearl, Indian brassware and silver ornaments, and pleated Jap silk lampshades with bead fringes. I thought it all too lovely for words. I'm not sure she was being quite sincere. Anyway, it gives a very good idea of the sort of place where Edith grew up when she was very young. Here the family entertained expensively and their social network was wide and rich. 5 maids looked after them. The Dempster's cook was called Mrs. Barlow, and the family would have champagne on Sundays before lunch. Jane, an Irish Liverpudlian, came to work for the Dempsters as nurse for Elizabeth and Edith, and she actually remained with Elizabeth for life, coming with her to Boulder Bridge House, where she married Murray the gardener and lived in the lodge until she died in 1960. The gardens at Norwood were looked after by the head gardener, Hooley, who later went to work for John and Mary at Park Lee, my great-great-grandparents. Hooley managed to grow mushrooms at Norwood, which was a huge novelty for the north of England. The stables of Norwood were partly built from old farm buildings and were home to the horses, as well as the groom and coachman. Elizabeth Dempster's pony was called Cassius, and you can see the hoof of Cassius at Sutton Hoo today. Their neighbours including Sir Henry Lee, once MP for Southampton, whose granddaughter was Vivian, Baroness Corley. Also, the Dean of Manchester lived opposite. They had very early cars, and here is Robert's car with Elizabeth Dempster being driven by a friend. The Dempsters attended church at St Paul's Congregational Church in Kersal, where many of Manchester's great industrialists were members of the congregation. The family would go to the Halle concerts, which were a grand event in Manchester at the time. Elizabeth remembered that in those days people put on their best evening clothes. That meant cloaks, jewels, and gold. It was rather like going to the opera in London, although, she says, it was totally different, of course. At the crack of dawn each day, Robert Dempster, Elizabeth and Edith's father, would leave in his carriage for his work on Oldham Road. In about 1900, he bought one of the first cars in England. It did not occur to these early car owners that they might drive their own cars, and coachmen were not easily converted to chauffeurs. Robert's foreman, Watson, was taught to drive. He apparently never quite acquired the bearing of a chauffeur and had an almost unintelligible Lancashire accent and was extremely rude. Edith and her sister Elizabeth attended a little school called Povey's and May's, which was run by Miss Povey, whose father had been an admiral, and Miss May, whose father was a general. Elizabeth was born with a curvature of the spine, so she was later sent to school in the south of England to Rodine, which was by the sea, and there she could bathe in the fresh air and get better. Edith also attended Rodine. Both girls there lost their northern accents in this rarefied beachfront school. Here is Elizabeth at her coming out in Manchester. So that was a ritual presentation for 18-year-olds. And of course it happened in London at court as well, but in the north it happened in Manchester. And Edith also came out in Manchester. Elizabeth remembered her father, Robert, giving her a grand ball at the assembly rooms. She asked him, much to his shock, for boned turkey and trifle, which she thought was so very infantile, when in those days supper consisted of 6 or 8 courses, hot too. So I said I would have trifle and go all the way backwards through the menu, which I did and ended up with oysters, just to show what I could do. Elizabeth and Edith were both then later presented at Buckingham Palace, as was their cousin, my great-grandmother Mabel. And then you could also present your daughters. So my grandmother and all her cousins were then sort of later presented at court. I think much to their annoyance at times. I think it was probably rather sticky. So Edith and Elizabeth had a gilded childhood, spending a lot of time in Scotland with my side of the family at Methen Castle near Perth, and here they all are. On the left you've got my great-grandmother, and the third from the right you've got Edith, next door to John, great-great-grandfather, and then next door to him is Charles, who then took over Dempster's, and he was my great-uncle, and he rather ran it into the ground because he didn't accept that electricity was rather more important than gas by that time. So Elizabeth and Edith travelled widely with their parents and Uncle John and Mary. In Egypt, the Dempsters were one of the first parties to go along the Nile. And they were extremely intrepid, actually. Sorry, not to go along the Nile. The first party to take a train across the desert to Khartoum. And here is Edith in Palermo on the left, with my great-grandmother in the middle, and their friend Florence, or Floss Sayce, whose uncle was Archibald Sayce, the famous Egyptologist. So Elizabeth and Edith in Athens were taken to meet the Archbishop, whose footman, to Elizabeth's intense surprise, dressed in pale blue, and they handed round lovely rose leaf jam, which was very sweet, and they had little glass plates to eat it from. She also remembered that while they were in church in Athens, a very beautiful Englishwoman walked up the aisle, and she thought it was an Easter time, and it was Queen Mary of Romania. Elizabeth commented she really did look very much the Queen. On the same tour, the family travelled back to Vienna on the Orient Express. It was on the Thomas Cook cruise on the Nile that Elizabeth met her future husband, Frank Perkins. The Dempsters were by now, by any standards, exceedingly rich, and they were not hugely impressed by Frank's financial credentials, although the Perkins family were very well known in Hampshire and played an important role in the civic life of Southampton for generations. Edith was pretty intrepid. Here they are in a courtyard of a house on one of their grand tours, and looking at the earthquake ruins in Messina, and on the left you've got, of course, the pyramids. And this is my great-great-grandfather's boat, the Vol-au-Vent. This 104-ton vessel did very well in races, and my great-great-grandfather entertained King Edward on it and also beat the Kaiser in his own yacht race, the Heligoland Cup, which he won in 1903. Here is the cup. Kaiser on one side, the English king on the other. It was always the done thing to have the English king facing out and the poor Kaiser facing the wall. Edith actually raced aboard Vol-au-Vent for this great race, and was on board the imperial yacht Hohenzollern with her aunt and uncle, my side of the family, for a reception and meal hosted by the Kaiser. So quite exciting stuff. Her sister married in 1901, and here you see Edith as a bridesmaid second from the left, next door to my great-grandmother Mabel. And then a bit later on, here she is as great-granny's bridesmaid, far left, and my great-grandparents in the middle. So they're all quite close. So as I mentioned, in 1907, the Dempsters took the lease of Vale Royal Abbey in Cheshire. Here the family entered into the very grandest country house scale of life. There were shoots, hunt balls, meets, parties for thousands of the Dempster employees, as well as the usual round of county events. Edith's mother rose to the challenge of her demanding new role as a mistress of a very large house with a large staff with aplomb. She would sparkle in her magnificent tiara and jewels, but never tried to lose her northern accent, and was beloved by the tenantry and her staff. When referring to her husband, Mrs. Dempster always called him the master. Mrs. Dempster would go calling on her grand neighbours, something which her grandchildren never quite understood, driven by her chauffeur and accompanied by a little page who would tip the gatekeepers at various lodges. So this is Vale Royal Abbey. And this is Robert Dempster, Edith's father, in front of the south front, where the family mainly lived. And Edith's rooms were, and the family rooms were all on this side, looking over the water. On the first floor were the original staterooms of the Tudor house. The Dempsters were abroad in 1911, and even then the staff at Vale Royal, despite their absence, consisted of the housekeeper, cook, first footman, second footman, first laundry maid, first housemaid, 3 housemaids, the hall man, the kitchen maid, the laundry maid, and the scullery maid. While the family were in residence, it would nearly double to include the butler, the lady's maid, the valet, and the secretary. There were 47 reception rooms and bedrooms in constant use at Vale Royal. Edith's parents did a great deal of public work, which she witnessed, of course, when they lived at Vale Royal. In 1908, 250 of the tenantry were entertained by Mr. and Mrs. Dempster at the house, which included guided tours of both the house and the garden, tea and a vote of thanks to Robert. In 1909, Mrs. Dempster entertained the children from a local school to a Christmas party at the house, at which Father Christmas gave out presents in the saloon. In 1910, a troop of Boy Scouts was formed by Edith at Vale Royal, during which they were shown the Delamere collection of armour, given a huge tea, and were played the gramophone, something quite special for the time. In 1911, 24 guests from the Archaeological Society were invited to Vale Robert to see Robert's extraordinary excavation of the huge Cistercian Abbey, something that Edith would certainly have been very heavily involved in. In 1912, the Northwich Wesleyan Circuit held a gathering for 5,000 Wesleyan Methodists in the grounds of the Abbey. In 1914, Robert hosted 5,000 Liberal Party members at Vale Royal, the first time any master of the great house had taken the chair at such a meeting. Tour and sports followed. And in 1915, 2,500 people came to a fete in the park, which was organised by the Winsford Hospital to augment funds for the Albert Infirmary. So really, they did a huge amount of public work. Here we see the saloon at Vale Royal at the time the Dempsters were there, packed with plants and a whole mix of furniture, including arts and crafts chairs, French all-milieu furniture, and of course a lot of silk and velvet. And on the ceiling can be seen all of the shields of all the families the Cholmondeley family of the Lords Delamere had married into over the years. This is the state dining room, where the Dempsters would eat pretty much every day when they were there. Huge meals. And I always love tables which have these little candlesticks with lamps on top. And around the walls were royal portraits, and each of the chairs had a D for Delamere surmounted by a coronet. These are the gardens which were created by Edith's parents, and this is part of the garden which Robert modelled on Tivoli, with a sequence of little canals and waterfalls and bridges, looking down towards the River Weaver. And these are the Dempster cars, 4 of them, plus the coaches, and in one of the garages was a state landau, which wasn't ever used, but they kept there. And Mrs. Dempster, Edith's mother, would go, when formally travelling, she would have the coachman wearing the full livery of the Delameres. And this, of course, is the Abbey excavation of 1912, which was really a very notable thing because it showed that Vale Royal was one of the very largest Cistercian houses in England. And you can see the house is very small, just covering part of the cloister. But Edith witnessed her father doing this at great personal expense, and it must have been something which she remembered when she came to do her own work at Sutton Hoo on the excavations there. Edith's mother, Elizabeth, died at Vale Royal in 1919. She had been very popular in Cheshire and performed the role of benevolent grande dame with great aplomb and also with a certain amount of modesty. Robert Dempster carried on living at Vale Royal, but Edith stayed with him to make sure he was all right. They were in Cape Town in 1925, where he died. Edith persuaded the captain of the ship to bring Robert back on the RMS Windsor Castle of the Union Castle Mail Steamship Company, but only on condition that she did not mention to anyone that she didn't mention to anyone that the ship had a body on board. The captain was concerned apparently not about the passengers' sensitivities, but about his crew and their superstition. It's wonderfully Agatha Christie. So on to dear old Edith, and here she is during her presentation at court with her close friend Ellie Luard on the right. Something which it doesn't look like she particularly enjoyed, but anyway, it was something you sort of did. Mary Hopkirk, her niece said, "We thought Edith was very pretty and she had lovely clothes and lots of followers. She had travelled a great deal with her parents and was very enterprising and always ready to try anything new, whether it was a car, camera, perm, or anything." Edith was probably the shyer of the 2 Dempster girls, but she became, of course, the most well-known. She did not marry soon after she'd come out in Manchester, or even after undergoing a court presentation in London, but instead moved to Vale Royal with her parents, where she threw herself into public service in a big way. She was extremely well-travelled, having visited Egypt, Greece, Austria, Hungary, and more. I think she'd visited every continent in the world. After Rodin, she finished her education with 6 months in Paris, which was spent with her best friend and a chaperone. After Paris, her parents took on a world tour that included British India and the United States. In 1922, she was invited to stand for a safe seat for the Conservatives, which was quite a rarity for a woman at the time. She could easily have become the 2nd female member of Parliament, but she decided not to contest the seat that was won by her friend Lord Colin Crichton Stuart. Her reasons were that she must look after her father, who was the widowed and alone, and she felt this great responsibility, which really held her back in some ways. She was later on one of the first female magistrates. She was no pushover. When she was 42 and returning from the Mayfair Hotel on foot in full evening dress, she was accosted and assumed to be a woman of the night. She turned on the bemused middle-aged man saying, "I'm a magistrate, and if you don't clear off, I shall give you in charge." He fled. During the First World War, Edith was a nurse at Vitry-le-François for the Red Cross, and she served as quartermaster for the Red Cross Auxiliary Hospital at Winsford near Vale Royal. And she also helped her parents with the housing and care of Belgian refugees at Vale Royal. In 1919, as I said, her mother died at Vale Royal, and Edith devoted her time to looking after her father until he died in 1925. At which point, Edith and Elizabeth inherited half of their father's estate, which was valued at the time at more than £500,000, a very great sum in those days, and Edith and Elizabeth became very rich. Here is Robert, and this is his gravestone at Vale Royal. Interestingly, of course, you can see it's very Celtic influence, which I suppose was fashionable at the time, but it's amazing to think of this sort of design when a few years later, Edith actually dug up the Sutton Hoo treasure. Edith's father, Robert, had not hidden his wish for his daughters to marry into the aristocracy. Elizabeth had married perfectly well, but not to someone with a coronet. Edith did have many suitors, principal of which was Frank Pretty, who had proposed to her on her 18th birthday, and if it is to believe, every year after that. Robert was not impressed by Frank's relatively small wealth and standing, even though the Prettys were the largest corset makers in the country. Frank's father, William Pretty, owned the Gold Rood in Ipswich, which is still there, from where Frank and his brother would indulge in their love of fox hunting. Before I go to that, I'll just show, this is Edith after her sister had married, and the house is quite empty. This is her in the saloon at Vale Royal, quite alone with a dog on her lap, but really almost waiting for life to begin again. And this is Frank with his family. Frank is on the far left with his brothers and father at their house in Ipswich. He'd been a major in the Suffolk Regiment's 4th Territorial Battalion, which had been founded in the gardens of their house. He'd been wounded twice during the war. His participation in the Battle of Neuve-Chapelle in 1915 was captured in 1918 painting by Fred Rose. After the war, Frank continued in the Suffolk Regiment, becoming a lieutenant colonel and commander of the 4th Battalion. He also worked for the family corset business in Ipswich. After her father's death, Edith accepted Frank's proposal. They were married in grand style at Vale Royal in 1926, and my grandmother was the youngest bridesmaid, along with my great aunt and their Dempster and Perkins cousins. So there's my granny, the little one, on the left of the photograph there, and Edith in front of Vale Royal with the lucky horseshoe above the porch and Union Jacks. Edith gave up the lease of the vast house and sold much of her parents' furniture. She bought the 520-acre Sutton Hoo estate for £15,000 along the River Deben near Woodbridge in Suffolk. She became a magistrate and carried on in Suffolk her love of hunting, which she so much had enjoyed in Cheshire, and the Pretty family were very big hunting people. This was after her wedding. These are just some of the presents stacked up in the library at Vale Royal. So they had a few things to fill their new house with, and here it is, Sutton Hoo House. The current house is quite a lot smaller because the wing on the right is gone. It was a large modern house built in 1910. Edith and Frank moved in with their staff, quite a large staff, which consisted of her personal maid, the butler, footman, housekeeper, cook, various maids and manservants. The house had nearly 20 bedrooms and was so well built, it was joked, that it could have been used as a factory by its first industrial owner. In 1930, at the age of 47, Edith gave birth to her son, Robert Dempster Pretty, named after her father. At the time, Edith also developed typhoid, from which she never really recovered. And Frank died just 4 years later in 1934 of stomach cancer. So it was really rather tragic that they'd waited so long for having a son and out of caring for her father, and eventually they did, and it was short-lived really. There's Sutton Hoo House again. Bottom left was where Edith's sitting room was, and the centre the dining room, and Edith's bedroom top left. And there it is from the front, a photograph from our albums. And there is Edith and her son, Robert Dempster Pretty. And another photograph of Robert with his boat. He had quite a lonely childhood in this huge house. So Robert and Edith carried on living in secluded and lonely grandeur at Sutton Hoo. So Edith suddenly became old and tired, dropped all her public work and social life, and she took to spiritualism and became rather a recluse. She began visiting a faith healer called William Parish and supporting a spiritualist church in Woodbridge. She made a small chapel at Sutton Hoo, which I've seen, next to Frank's old study. It is still there. Edith's interest in the archaeology had been helped very much by her father's notable excavation of the lost Cistercian Abbey at Vale Royal, as well as her travels to many ancient sites with her friend Florence Sayce. When she bought the estate at Sutton Hoo, Edith was well aware of the strange mounds that dominated the barren parkland around the house. At some point in the 1930s, Edith had a strange dream about a ghostly funeral procession to one of the mounds. In 1938, Edith decided to open the barrows. One of the estate retainers, old Pettit, had always assured Edith that a fabulous treasure of gold lay under the tumuli. Russell Perkins, Edith's nephew and a cousin of my grandmother, had repeatedly diagnosed the presence of gold and silver in the largest barrow. The excavation work was carried out solely at the expense of Edith and under the remote supervision of the Ipswich Museum. Edith suggested to the museum that Basil Brown, shown here in this photograph, a retired school teacher and amateur archaeologist from nearby, should lead the work. He had repeatedly asked Edith to open the mounds. She finally decided to. They began on the second largest barrow, but nothing was found. It appeared that it had already been raided. In May 1939, they started on the largest mound. The windy weather would blow the sand and later gold leaf into the face of the little band of estate workers working on it. In July, the stupendous hoard was first seen. Basil Brown had discovered this greatest of all Saxon finds. Here we see Edith with Princess Mary Louise at Sutton Hoo with the outline of the enormous boat that had been found. And here we see a painting by Cor Visser, who also painted Edith, of the ship. This, of course, all happened against the backdrop of the start of the Second World War. At this point, a band of professional archaeologists from London asserted their control over the site. The entire hoard spent its first night above ground underneath Edith's bed. It was too bulky to fit in her safe. A few days later, the treasure was removed to London. Edith's chauffeur Lyons remembered that silver plates were bright and clean, just like new ones out of a shop, only the top one of the pile being tarnished and corroded. The outbreak of war meant that the find, quite luckily, received little publicity. This was even luckier because a few months later, an Italian bomber was brought down in the vicinity of the parkland and heath, and the heath itself became a training ground. The treasure spent its wartime snug, safely in Aldwych Tube in London. An inquest was held on the 14th of August 1939 to decide the ownership of the hoard. The British Museum officials tried to persuade the jury to do the proper thing to get it awarded to the Crown. They had no idea what Edith would eventually decide. Her niece, Mary, heard that a telegram also came from the Norwegian government offering £250,000 for it. Mary wrote, "The award depends on whether the deceased owner intended to return and collect it, in which case it was treasure trove, or to take it with him to another life. This was a complicated theological problem. Nobody knew who the deceased owner was, let alone his religious views. The coroner's jury of 14 local men, comprising of the blacksmith, the publican of the plough-in, the postmaster, the schoolmaster, a haulage contractor, a grocer, a land agent, and a golf club secretary, and a retired banker in general, and 4 farmers." That was the jury which had to decide this. Samples of the treasure were sent down from London and exhibited in a glass case. The jury listened to the museum officials and retired the gents for 25 minutes to consider the religious beliefs of the deceased. They returned shortly after that time to award the treasure to the owner of the land on the grounds that it was found in the parish and it should stay in the parish. Edith then gave the entire treasure to the nation. She never lived to see it displayed at the British Museum. Here is Edith, that summer of 1939, this shorter woman behind the woman in front, who is my mother's grandmother. This was at my great-aunt's wedding, and Edith there, very shy, modest, behind, getting out of the car, weighed down by all this attention, which she really never coveted. I spoke to her great nephew, Robin, the other week, and I said to him, what would Edith have done with this treasure? Was it the natural thing she would have done, give it all away? And he said, absolutely, that was the sort of person she was. Her life was devoted to public service and looking after other people, and also the feeling that she'd been given a very lucky lot in life and she should really do something about it. Edith died in 1943 as the storms of war were raging about. Her generosity of spirit would give the nation a deep boost at its hardest hour. She, as was typical, sought no thanks or acknowledgement at all. Robert, her son, left Sutton Hoo and was taken in by Edith's sister Elizabeth. The 2 sisters had remained extremely close, and Robert was brought up as one of Elizabeth's own. Here is a picture of Elizabeth with her daughter Mary, who I'm so indebted to for doing so much of the research for this. This is at Buckingham Palace in the 1920s. And here is Elizabeth at her 80th birthday, and sitting by her feet and the black Labrador is Robert Dempster Pretty. her nephew. And the Pretty family have been so generous back to Sutton Hoo still, and you can see some of the things they've bequeathed the National Trust there. But I hope that's a little bit of an introduction to the real Edith Pretty, ahead of The Dig, which comes out tomorrow on Netflix. And I very much enjoyed sharing this with you, and I hope that you enjoy watching this. Thank you very much. And this is dedicated to the memory of Edith's niece, Mary Hopkirk, the real family historian as far as I'm concerned.